Hi, beautiful souls. Welcome once again. Now, this video is going to be a little bit of fun. I was in a chat on a live stream the other day, and we were talking about the things that I'd done, some of the crazy things I'd done in my spiritual journey. And in some respects, they were crazy, but they were amazing and a blast at the same time. So here it is. I'm going to be talking about my experiences, specifically in what we called the tank. Now, it could be described as a maze or a labyrinth. And somebody pointed out that a labyrinth, there are no obstacles, and it drops you into a deep meditative state. And I can tell you that it is entirely possible to go into a deep meditative state in a maze as well, or in where there are obstacles, because that was the way that you found your way to what was designated the center of that maze. So this is going to be almost like an episode of Tall Tales and True, or could even be part of my True Stories series. If you haven't seen the other True Stories, I'll put a link above here. So suspend disbelief. So the tank was an opportunity to experience one whole lifetime in one session in the tank. And what this did was, when you stayed awake within the tank, you understood a lot about your program, because you were seeing it in a very intense way. So when I first went to the school, we didn't really have a labyrinth, have a tank, for, I'm guessing, around 5 years. So I first went to the school when I was 28. And so about 5 years later, the tank was introduced. And when it was first introduced, it was very small compared to what it became many years later. And the obstacles were not very difficult at all, if at all there. Maybe one tube that you crawled through, maybe. That's from my memory. It was such a long time ago to do this. But we were initially blindfolded and led into the field, and we found our way into the labyrinth, into the tank. And through holding a vision of the center of the void, or the center of all things, you would set up like a rubber band between you and it. So the school was, in a way, like one of those ancient mystery schools in Egypt, where you where you were challenged. You were challenged to break through your doubt, your limitations, your concepts of what you could do or not do. And again, as I said, if you stayed awake and aware in these processes, you learned an awful lot about yourself. So the first time I went, I remember, and it was actually the first time I ever got to what was designated the center, the void of the tank. Estukia sakudush deshtastianaka embiataka. So I'm not quite sure why I'm being prompted to bring through some light language. It's really popping up inside of me. And I think it's got to do with the energies that are flowing at the moment. So I would say that in amongst my story, there is some fantastic activation codes. So have a listen for the light language. It isn't necessarily, I think, about the story. Maybe needing to get the story onto a recording was sort of an excuse for me to bring these codes forward at this moment. It's entirely possible. Ishushian zakabakaka kiatsa se e be te to o te e ka atata se e tianaka. Bebeti shet saka opo uti shin zikidia takamaka o ze ti jetena. Ojetia boko se si shanze kia bababati inze tusha siya kamoko yetia sen yananaka. So the first time I went, I was in bliss, and I found a place within my being, my mind space, where I was what we ended up calling being analogical, and that is one with all things. So we get around normally day to day in a binary state, which is the polarity, which is reflective of the polarity of this realm, the duality. And the way you went through all the disciplines, all the exercises that we were taught was to be in that analogical. So to define how you find that analogical state, it is to be within what I call the void. It is to be in the all and the all, and expand your consciousness to encompass and be everything in that all and all. Abakaya te shushana, she shushaniataka. So if you were to close your eyes and look into the darkness behind your eyelids, you could see into infinity. And we ended up doing this thing where we would look every direction in our mind's eye, including up and down, and then expand our energy into infinity and become the infinity. And it's a place of no time, it's the now. It's a place of bliss. It's a place of no thinking. You're not really having a thinking process when you're in this space. And by focusing upon what is called the void, you became it. And 0.0, or the void, is a very high frequency. It is the pinnacle, I suppose, of the pyramid. The model that I have of this reality utilizes the form of a pyramid. And for me, 0.0 is that top of the pyramid. And when you become that, you are entraining your body's frequency to be of a like frequency of 0.0. So you are reaching for a higher frequency, a more inclusive frequency, a frequency that isn't in polarity. Ishukanya takoyeti gendabatia. Usheasi kuyeti andakamaki chetsa. Eshia sakamaki detsu shenaka. So take a breath and drop into your heart. Ijatukie beatia naka, and feel and breathe. Eshu seba andi chetsukuya nokoyetsa baati shenze kiyonokoya. So when I was in this, the first time I ever went, I was in this blissful place. And as I'm walking through, because we held our hands here, so we weren't feeling the walls at all. And actually, maybe I should explain what the tank looked like. It had metal frames that had plastic over them to make a wall. And it was reconfigured every time. So you could move this wall, move that wall, put a hole in this wall, do all sorts of different things and reconfigure it quite easily. So there's some energies coming through for the fifth energy center as well. So have just sit within that throat area and have a feel and breathe. Ishe sakamoye anyongu. Eshe si senze tushena. Imbiata kriet sekuchenza ki ambaka. Ujetsi sesiana kamakike. So I would be walking through with my eyes blindfolded, and I was in this zone of analogical state. I now realize later, a place of oneness. And I had this stray thought just come in and out. And because I was new at this, I went, oh, I wonder if this is analogical. I wonder if this is the right state, correct state, or, was I just pretending or imagining it? And that the minute I said that, in those early days, this is what they did. They would open a door and you didn't know it, and they would grab your arm and pull you through into the next section and close the door. And this said to me, yes, this was the correct state. So I regathered myself, centered and started breathing and kept walking. And at one point, I banged into a wall, and there was a little metal door down below. And I thought, oh, so I got down on my hands and knees and crawled through. And I was outside the tank. I had left. I had exited the tank. And I started to laugh. And then again, a stray thought popped into my mind that this was reflective of how I didn't want to be in this life, really. And it is true, I have struggled to be here the whole time I've been here, for many different reasons, I'm sure. I could go into them, but I won't. They're related to past lives, other realities, things that I experienced in this life. So when I had this thought it's like a lightning strike, this thought. It just comes out of nowhere. It's this light bulb moment that I didn't really want to be in this life this time. I started to cry. And I sobbed. I tell you, it was a deep gut sob. And it was a release. And what happened then was, somebody who was on the outside, one of the supervisors of the exercise, actually turned me around and pushed me back in the hole. And I went back in, and I was on my hands and knees, crying the whole time. And I ended up going through another doorway, and I was in the center. And I knew I was, because there was all these people sitting. I couldn't see them, but as I was crawling, I could feel someone's leg, someone's foot, and they were all sitting waiting because they had gone to the center of the tank. So I sat in that center, in that void, sobbing for I don't know how long, having this huge release, emotional release around this energy within me, this part of me that didn't really want to be here this time. Ubiatishenza kamakika endayopote yande akuyenayanze siana idorjenemiande yekuyanianda. So eventually they called the test, and we were led out, and then we could take off the blinders, off the eye masks, so ripping the duct tape off and all of that. So as the years progressed, the tank got bigger and bigger and had a few more obstacles, like ladders that you climbed up and jumped down into the next section. And there were a couple of ladders to choose from, like you would hit the ladder and you wouldn't automatically take it, or sometimes you did, and you would back up and you would hit another ladder behind you, and you were going to have to find a way in your mind to do it. Which one would you take or not? Look for the third option. And so you're not really using your mind to analyze this, or you're trying not to. Let me tell you, that's the battle. It's to drop out of the head and just be pulled by consciousness, by the flow, through the various rooms and places within it. So after that first time, I could not feel, it was a long time before I felt emotion while moving through the tank. I would just grit my teeth and push the emotion aside and go for it. And that was the lesson in and of itself. To see how you dealt with the emotions, to see how you didn't want to feel them. And what would happen at a certain point is they would call the test and we would be led out, and you'd take off the mask, and that's when I would cry and I would just fall to the ground sobbing. So the reflection is that we don't want to feel the emotions. We are trying to get through life, gritting our teeth and just soldiering on. And those times that I did that way, for the first, I'm not sure, I did it maybe 24 times, 21 times I went to the tank in all those years. For the first few, I didn't feel anything while I was in the tank. I tried not to. And I actually remember the next time that I cried in the tank, and it was about something really silly and minor. Anyway, the fears about going to the tank were huge for me, and I'm sure for many, many people. So they would line everybody up and start taping them all. And then when they would make them sit in a field until there was a big enough group to let go, to stand up and go and walk. And every time I sat down, and I say this in my video, My Spiritual Journey, I talk about this. Every time I would be led over to sit down, I would cry in being afraid. And you just felt the fear, you just did it. And then when they said, okay, stand up to go, I just put it aside and went into that zone as best I could. Now, probably it took about 12 times before the moment came where I sat down and there was no fear. I had worked through that fear, the fear of the unknown, and I'm probably sure fear of other initiations in other lifetimes, where the consequences of not succeeding in a test were actually death. And that's my understanding of some of the Egyptian mystery schools, for a start, that you would be swimming underground, under the ground in tunnels filled with water, and sometimes you didn't make it and you drowned. This is my understanding of what has happened in previous eons regarding spiritual schools, mystery schools, Gnostic schools, to help you get through the humanness, the limitations of the human, to find out that we are bright sparks of source energy. So the fear left, and it got to the point where I didn't have fear whenever I went to the tank, and I didn't have fear inside it. I remember another time that we had these tubes that we crawled through, and you had to go through on your hands and knees, and it really helped deal with claustrophobia and birth trauma through the birth canal. A whole lot of different things were triggered by being in these situations, and they could be quite long and have junctions going off, so you could actually make a right turn and keep crawling, or you could go straight ahead. And I remember at one point, we weren't supposed to speak at all in the tank, and I was in this tube crawling through, and there were these two girls chatting. No, you're going the wrong way, go back that way. And that's what they were saying to me. And previous to that, I had given way and thought, oh, I must be wrong. And I would turn around and go back the way that I came, or go in a way different to the way that I wanted. Well, this one time when these girls did this was the funniest thing. I went, and it was a log jam because they were all coming and nobody knew from here which was the way to go. And I went, no, like this deep, deep, long no from my guts. I mean, it reverberated through my body, this no. I just sat there and went, no. And when I finished that and I got to move, there was no one around me. Maybe they were afraid I was about to explode or something. But it showed me, again, moving through life, how I always gave in to somebody else's directions. And when I said this, no, it cleared, and I continued on the way that I wanted to go. There were so many little moments that showed you various things. And it got so to the point where I was so comfortable in the tubes that I would lie down on my back and allow people to crawl over me to get where they wanted to go. Like, there were some people who were going really fast and weren't, wanted to get through the worm as fast as possible. And I was totally fine. And if I was going the opposite way and we came head to head, I would always lay down and let them crawl over me as I'm laying on the ground, and then I would get back up and continue on my own way. Now, when I did this from, I was in my 30s, early 40s, and I was very fit. I was really, I did state level gymnastics. I was a dancer, and so I was very flexible and lithe. So there were times when you needed to get through things, crawl through walls and things like that, that you had to be very flexible from my perspective. And when I think about it, when I did it all then, there were people who were in their 60s and 70s who did the tank. And I think, oh my God, now that I'm this age, I really acknowledge what they did. I really acknowledge their determination and willpower. Because for me, it was just like, in some respects, being in a playground. Once I got through the fear, that's what it was. Ebeti shunze kiata, bebeti kochetsi ambietu koyonoko. So as the tank got bigger, we went to onto another phase. And the phase was that you started a couple of fields away. That's where you were taped up and sat down. And so you would get up and walk using your mind down through the fields, through a creek. Often you went to the tank wet. Unless you were strong enough or focused enough, you could get out of that field, walk across a little bridge and get back in that way. So some people just didn't want to risk getting lost if they went out. So they just stayed and went through the creek. So that was the next thing. So getting down into the tank field. The next progression of this was we were led up into the forest. And I've talked about this a couple of times too. And you would need to navigate. So the property was fully fenced, so you didn't end up in the main street or anything. You would walk through the forest, being pulled with your mind, with your energy to the field, and then find your way to the tank, to the door, which was different every time, and then work your way through the tank to the void. And sometimes I got to the center, but mostly I didn't. If you were to look at the averages, I did not get to the center more than I didn't. I got lost in the forest, depending on what the lesson was. Like not getting anywhere. How do you cope with being lost or not progressing? Or how do you feel in comparison to the people that made it to the tank or even made it to the void when you didn't? Now, we were close to, the school was close to McCord Air Force Base and Fort Lewis. And there would be sometimes helicopters flying over. And we were all like, we all had our masks on generally when we were doing these disciplines outside, these exercises outside. And we were all like, trying not to be seen or didn't like being viewed. But they were interested. I came to find out through what people were talking about and what my teacher talked about, that they were interested in us because we were not asleep. We were so driven to find out another level to who we were. I mean, even the 60, 70, 80-year-olds who were driven and faced incredible physical challenges in this, in the various exercises we did. We were all just on a mission to find out who we could be, what we could be. And this is why they were interested in us. They were curious to what we were up to and how we coped. And my teacher told this story once where he was walking through the forest during one of these exercises where people were working their way. And he had a couple of people with him, escorts with him. And at one point he stopped, my teacher stopped, and he pointed in a direction and motioned to the guys that were with him. He said, "Look." And what there was somebody in camouflage. And they were, I don't know who they were. Were they from Fort Lewis? We didn't know. No, I don't think anybody ever knew. And he was very still. And that's why the two guys couldn't see him, because they train themselves to just be invisible. This is part of their training when they're doing what they do. And it was when my teacher could see him that he pulled up his hand and he talked into a microphone and he said, "I've been seen." And he had to leave. And he got up, and that's when the guys saw him, when he moved his hand, and he got up and he just disappeared through the forest and obviously over the fence. So they would hide in the forest and watch what we were doing, how we coped, how we tackled various things. Kuye kia batasi shenze kia nakamaka. Ibiti susena shetsi kenya nakakaba. Ibiti orsu shashi enanyaka. I jotsakia babati henze tushte nakama. Ibiti usakia naka. Embia tukosha. So I'm trying to think of some of the other. Okay, there was one time when I was in a huge crowd of people. Now, so there could be about 1,500 people that were in the tank at once, give or take. And when you were in a crowd, like shoulder to shoulder, trying to move through, you were in what was called social consciousness. That was where society is generally, the people that are asleep, they're all crammed in, not making any independent moves or directions, just being pulled backwards and forwards by the crowd. And one time I was there and my teacher was above and it was packed in this little spot. And he said, called down to us and he said, open the door, open the door. And I didn't think, obviously something deeper in me just stretched out my arm, and it was a panel, one of the panels, one of the walls. And I grabbed the metal and it was a door. And I pulled it towards me like there was no thought or anything. And he went, yes. So it just showed that it's not going to, when you move through life, it isn't necessarily something that you think about, you analyze, you take a step or anything. Sometimes you just step out and it is in the direction you need to go. So I moved through that moment. Now, whenever I went, I would move through the crowd pretty quick. I would always end up alone, deep within the tank, and not in the social consciousness at all. It wasn't my deal. It wasn't my issue. About 90% of the time, I would move through into this sort of area where you could walk and not feel anybody or bump into anybody for quite a while. And so what happens when you get into there, what happened to me was not moving forward, because there were times when I couldn't get out of my head after I moved beyond the crowd. And it is in a way reflective of breaking through a barrier that I sometimes couldn't break through. And just going around and around in circles, not necessarily where the unawakened group was or the social consciousness was, but it was in a further in part. And it was sometimes difficult to break through and find the next room. Ushteshu sakanyananaki kebet sesu shenze bitianaka, ebeti koshen nakamakia, embiatu shenza, e jotsanyanaka. And one of the other things that I would go through from time to time, particularly when I was deeper in, was it wasn't only my teacher that was up on top on the planks walking around watching us. There were, half a dozen guys also monitoring us, making sure nothing untoward was happening or anything like that. Or if someone wanted to get out of the test, they would help them do it if they wanted to stop. And one of the things that I dealt with was being watched and being judged. And it was something that I had to move through, that what did they think of me in my going round and around in circles? Did they think that I was hopeless? Did they think I was not as good as them? So there was a funny, as I said, everything shows. How do I feel about what people think about me was the lesson in that. And could I let go of that energy of judgment and not being good enough and find the zone again? Now, in the last 9 years at the school, I was a volunteer staff member. So I went to a lot of the events. And it got to the point where I was actually one of the people taping people up. And, it's because I had done it so many times, because I'd moved through the fear, that I was then had a big line of people coming to me. And I was processing everybody's fear. I was, as someone would come up, they'd be all levels of experience in doing the tank. And some of them would be like shivering and shaking. And I would talk with them, make them laugh, And somehow I helped them process their fear. And it was such an honor, I tell you, to these. I did a few, I was what they called an angel a few times in those 9 years, quite a few times, where I watched over others while they were doing their exercises. And they were like my children. I loved them and urged them on to do well. I mean, I was invested in a way in all of them. As they came up, I said, I would talk to them and help them through the energy, help them whatever, to breathe, etc. So it was such an honor to do that for another human being on their journey. Ubeatu shenzi kanya takamakika, ebeti shesu senze kiata. And another time that I remember was I was let go in the forest, and within 2 steps, I was at the fence of the tank field. And that, I know that I teleported to that point because that was my focus, to find the fence. It just seemed I did it in two portions. Maybe I'd ended up outside the tank if I was focusing on that, but I was focusing on the very specific type of fence that was around the field. And truly, literally 2 steps, I was right there at the fence. So I know that. And there were observations of people teleporting from the forest to the tank. And not the sort of people that you would think. Sometimes there were elderly people who teleported. It's got nothing to do with your body. It's all to do with your mind and your level of focus. So I'm trying to think if there's anything else to talk about with regard to the tank. You move through it. On one time that I did it, I was in I wouldn't know how you describe it. I was in an altered state, and I just was moving through without thought, just like when I reached out to open that door. And I remember I was watching myself in a way move through the tank and just flowing, just stopping, turning right and putting my hands out, and there's a little hole in the wall. Without looking for it or thinking about it, instinctively I knew, well, I didn't know, an aspect of me knew, and turned, and there was the hole. So I crawled through into the next section. So it was a fascinating experience, all of the tank over those years. I don't think there's too much else to tell that I can remember. If I ever think of anything more, I may do a part 2. But I hope that gives you a little bit of an understanding that I've been looking at my life and how I am for a long time. And it's a really fascinating subject. Have a wonderful, fantastic day, beautiful souls. Till next time.